Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. I'm your host Anna, and on today's episode, we are discussing narrative in long running games such as MMOs and live service games. And on today's episode, I have two guests with me who kindly agreed to share their expertise. Diane and James, hello both. Would you like to introduce yourself? I feel like you'll do it way better than me.
Sure. Hello, I'm James. I'm probably best known as Mod Raven from working on RuneScape for the past 100,000 years as a sort of narrative developer there.
Diane?
Yeah, I'm Diana, also previously of RuneScape. I was Mod Shrike for about 2 years, did a bunch of quest writing for that, and I'm now a narrative designer at Splash Damage.
How are you guys doing today in general?
Cold.
Fair enough.
It's good. Sunday afternoon, nothing much happening. It's all good.
Fair enough. Well, let's jump right in. So, narrative design for like RuneScape, is it much different than designing a narrative for like a game that has an ending?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've kind of hit the nail on the head for why it's different. I think the thing that people sometimes forget with live games is that they don't end. The whole point of the story you're building in the game you're building is that it has to effectively run in perpetuity. So you have to build stories with that in mind. It's not like a one-shot game like The Last of Us or God of War or anything like that. It's like, right, we can have this massive climax and then it ends and you put the game down and it's finished. In theory, with a live game, you never reach that stage. So that's the biggest difference between for the biggest challenge, I think, for building stories for live games as well.
There's another spanner in the works when coming to write story for a live service game as well, which is obviously, you're right, like no ending is a thing, but it's also important that live service games need to be agile. They need to change. They need to adapt to what the players expect, what people want out of the game, and that means that your stories have to adapt and change. You can set the greatest plan in the world, but it will it will hit impediments, it will hit obstacles, it will hit changes in what players expect, changes in what the company expects, and that's when you need to pivot and change, and you need to adapt your story so it works with the new direction that the game is going in, and you need to be able to do it quite quickly as well, which can be interesting.
On the topic of like never ending, like obviously when we read stories, this is kind of like the satisfying part of it, being like you go through it, you want to know like who is the killer at the end. How do you deal with not having that in a live service game?
So it's I'll jump in on this one, but it's a bit of a tricky question, that, because you do answer those sorts of questions. So the contained story of like who committed the murder, who did the thing, you will answer those because you'll have those as contained things. What you don't answer is like the whole story of the entire world. You always have something to tag on, have something to build. The way I describe it is, if you can answer one question, you should give two more questions for people to ask. Because with a live service game, it's not about being told a story, it's about living in the story, living in the world, and players want to be able to have a place they can sit and have a place they can theorize and talk about and get into those characters, get into those worlds, and have stories that conclude so it feels like the world exists, but they still want to feel like there's always new stuff to gather.
So
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, the way that I like thinking of it, it's more like a TV serial than a film.
Yeah.
Like a lot of like, I know it's a bit of a dud note to compare games to film or anything like that because it's a different medium, but in terms of storytelling approach, it is analogous. Because if you think about it, the cliche is soap operas. Like as soon as any episode ends on a soap opera, there's another cliffhanger and another cliffhanger, and they read on to each other, and it's how they can run for 30, 40 years. Live games are kind of the same. Like you say, like once you finish one story, you should be kind of immediately setting up the next one to keep players, to keep giving players stuff to be interested in, and to like you say, to keep asking those questions and answering them within a season. It's why a lot of games do seasonal approaches, because then you can say, right, this is the threat for this year, this is the threat for this season, we've resolved that, but wait, there's more, and then repeat, and being able to keep that going sustainably is a challenge. It's fun though. You know, when it goes well, it means you do create this world that I like that difference between players being told a story and players living in a world that has stories going on. I think that's a really nice difference to highlight.
So like the main problems with like series usually is the fact that it's like first season is amazing, second season is like good, and then third season, fourth season, fifth season, it's kind of like everyone forgets about it because it is difficult to maintain a story like going, right? So like how would you like do you have any advice to people about like dealing with that? How do you get a story running for years and years?
So I've got an immediate bit of advice, which is keep your threats relatively grounded. The moment you go to the top tier threat, like you can't come back from that. You can try, but if you've done the whole like the universe eaters are awake to devour all of time and space, then
RuneScape fans all know why I'm doing that.
after you've dealt with the universe eaters, and your next step is, Bob who stabs the local butcher. It doesn't have anywhere near that same sort of, gravitas. People aren't that interested. There are ways of making it interesting, but it's much, much harder. I think if we go on TV series and spoilers, one of the best examples for a TV series that just completely jumped the shark with it is Supernatural. And what Supernatural did in one of the episodes is the baddie was literally God, or more accurately, the sister of God, who is effectively God. Like an omnipotent entity was the baddie, and then after that they were like, "Oh, who's our new villain?" And I watched, I think, the first couple of episodes of the season after, and the new villains were some English toffs that run some sort of magic country club, and it's like, I'm out. I'll just no. It's just ridiculous, and that's where you've got to be super, super careful. Which Diana will know well. Sorry, Diana.
Yeah. There is, for a bit of context, if you're not into RuneScape, I was the main storyteller for basically the quest that looked at that threat for RuneScape. It had a whole season and multiple years of storytelling building up to a universe-ending threat, and then I had to make the quest that paid that off, and it was extremely difficult. I'm proud of what we made in the end, but it taught me that kind of threat, the world is ending, the universe is ending, is extremely difficult to pull off for a live game because you don't finish it after you resolve that storyline. You have to keep going. And how, your options there, the options I had to give the players there were either you defeat a universe ending threat, and therefore any threat you face afterwards is just completely meaningless because you have defeated the universe eaters, and like, well, what's the point of doing anything else now? I'm the most powerful being ever. Or what I went with going is that you survive this and you make sure the least worst option happens, to make sure that you don't end up like the threats afterwards still feel even vaguely relevant. And the result of that, a lot of players didn't like that. A lot of players thought, oh no, I wanted to be the universe enders, I wanted to kill these gods. And like, well, if I had, you'd be complaining about something else. Like, it was the least worst option we had. But I think my advice in that situation is actually advice that I learnt from our lead designer on RuneScape mods, Jack. I always get his name mixed up with his actual name, which is scope out the consequences of the stories you want to tell within the context of your live game before you decide to make them. And also, balance that against the pivots and the agile nature of these games that you need to bear in mind. But make sure that the stories you want to tell are the kind of stories you can tell within the game you are using, because not all games can tell all stories.
There's an additional bit as well, which is quite interesting, which is the problem with a live service game and storytelling is that people know a live service game is a live service game. They know it's going to continue. They know that the income of the game is based on it continuing and running and you paying subscription, MTX, whatever it is that you pay. So if you have a universe-ending threat, everyone knows full well the universe is not going to end. They know full well you are not going to destroy huge chunks of the game. You're not going to wipe out loads of existing game content because people want to be able to access and play that content. And you don't delete content from your game if you can help it, because someone will like it, and if you can keep it, you can keep it. So this is a problem that we had with RuneScape again, with this when we had this sort of the best example I have is we did a world event. So a world event is like a time limited event where a load of stuff happened, all the players get together, do a thing, and there's a narrative associated with it. And this world event was Tusker is coming, and Tusker was this god who is basically this big sort of bestial animal creature. And what Tusker does is Tusker turns up a planet and sort of smashes it to pieces and keeps on going. And so that was what Tusker represent. They are a threat. They're a world-ending threat. And players had limited time to solve this world-ending threat, or the world will end. Except, of course, the world was never going to end, and players knew the world was never going to end. So a huge chunk of what some players tried to do is to try and make the world end, to see what would happen. Because I think we did have plans to disable a bunch of stuff, but it was mostly it was cosmetic. It was like adding damage to the area, maybe kill off a couple of relatively useless NPCs. But in terms of game content, you can't actually remove it. So from a player point of view, the world-ending threat isn't a world-ending threat because the stuff they engage with isn't affected. It's just a cosmetic overhaul, and that doesn't work for a lot of people. That doesn't have that connection, that spark, that kind of that feeling, which in a series is a bit, TV series or a book is a bit easier to control because you can end stuff in those, right? You can blow up the world and have the characters exist on another planet or a pocket dimension, or they can go back in time and do stuff like that. They should never do time travel. Sorry, we did time travel. It was a headache.
Yeah, no, never.
I would never recommend time travel to anyone ever, particularly for a live service game. Do not do it. Do not do it. It may sound fun,
very
but
curious
don't.
how you approached it.
So we tried to do it with and I'm rambling now. I'm sorry, Diana, but we tried to
That's
do it
all
with the sort of time travel rules, which is that if you went back in time, then largely it would have created the timeline you were currently in. So we could do time travel, but only if it set up the world that we had going. Because of course, if you say change the world and it doesn't actually change the world, it just makes a headache. And for particularly like an MMO, when you've got multiple players existing in the same place. Now, obviously, there's some hand waving. You don't expect all players to be at the exact same point in the storyline, even though some players very much argue that they are, which makes certain scenes very confusing. And they go, but I'm talking to this character and you're talking to that character. They can't be both in the same place at the same time. No. Sorry, rant. So yeah, we had to be very careful with limiting our rules so that it would set these things up. And even then, oh my god, did it cause a headache? Because of course players would go, well, why can't I go back in time and fix X? So it made it when we had our stories and we didn't give them the options of doing that. So the example they used was in RuneScape. Spoilers for anyone who's not got to this point in RuneScape yet for somehow. We killed one of the big three gods. So there was the three gods of sort of Saradomin, Zamorak, and Guthix. And Guthix is the god of balance. And therefore, because he's true neutral, he's everyone's favourite. Because sometimes he was nice and sometimes he kicked you in the shins, And so we killed him to set off everything that was going up in the thing. And then we spent a good deal of time fleshing out his backstory post-death so that people could see what kind of character he was and learn more about him. And then so players, like, when they got to go back in time, they're like, well, why can't I go and save him? Why can't I go and warn him? Like, he's my mate. Why can't I? And then so that causes that kind of confusion because with something like an MMO as well, it's a bit like it's less like a TV series and more like running a long-term D&D game.
Yeah,
because,
that's true. Actually, it's more like
you've got to give room for the players to make those decisions and the players to set things. I mean, you've got to be willing to change your story based on seeing how players interact and players how they deal with things. Like, because if you're telling a story where you've made God Y out to be the bad guy, and absolutely everyone is on God Y's side, you can really try and go ham and say, no, he's definitely the bad guy, honest, definitely. But if everyone's pro that character, it's generally better to go, okay, maybe we write some sort of redemption or some sort of, actually they were secretly a good guy all along. So you have the players sort of capture on board with it. I've gone off on a tangent, haven't I?
I think it's all part of the scope out the consequences before you jump in, and this is something that comes up more widely in game development, within narrative design. I feel like we're talking about a lot of negative stuff here, but just like one last one before we start talking about how cool it is. It's very easy in games to go, oh, wouldn't that be cool? Let's make this. Let's make this really cool sounding scene. And kind of the job of narrative designers is to make it all make sense within the world, make the mechanics make sense, make the environment make sense, and kind of wrangle everything into a certain direction. And with MMOs and with live games, if you have that compounding over years and years and years of layered on content, it becomes quite complicated and it becomes quite difficult. So planning ahead, scoping out the consequences, and also being agile and responsive to what players want and what players respond well to. It's quite a tricky balancing act. But the thing you want to avoid is just like this mess of compounded problems, because that limits your storytelling abilities going forward.
So how do you keep track of all of the stories that have happened over years?
Oh, I mean, me personally, I just happen to have a good memory for that kind of thing, so I just write it down and remember it. Things like player wikis are often very useful as well, because a lot of the times, and I've seen this in lots of MMOs, same with Warframe, with Destiny, with World of Warcraft, and with RuneScape, the players who are really into the lore keep pretty meticulous records of everything on wikis, and they're actually a really good dev resource, especially if they're new to the team and they need to read up on an area that they're not 100% familiar with, and maybe internal documentation covers it from a high level perspective, but like the particular details and how it links to everything else might not be comprehensively documented, just because reasons, for game devs, it might not be the highest of priorities, because the development of the game is, rather than sitting down and thinking about all the little consequences. But players love doing that, and they love writing that stuff down and sharing it. So they're actually, player wikis and stuff, and well-kept player wikis are extremely useful when it comes to keeping track of the story.
Oh my god,
Players
I
in
love
general,
player
I'd say,
wikis.
Yeah. They can be wrong. Sometimes they do assert things and infer things that are just completely wrong. But that's the flip side of it. Most of the time it's pretty good. Yeah.
It's not just wikis as well. Like, players themselves are a fantastic resource for these things, and with the sort of growing media that people can use these days, like player lore videos are fantastic. There are a bunch of them on like YouTube and whatnot. Some of them get really, really into it, and there's a few like lore podcasts as well that are worth kind of keeping an ear in. I mean, you're right. Quite often they'll be very wrong, or they'll go off on bizarre theories. Although, actually, bizarre theories are a really good thing to listen into, because sometimes players will have a way better idea than you had, and an idea that fits what you've set up much better than your idea as well. And so that's one of the important things in for a nav designer doing uh, a live service game, is don't have a huge ego, or try not to have a huge ego, which is ironic coming from how I presented Mod Raven to all the RuneScape players. But it's important to be willing to change your ideas and listen to other people's thoughts and things, and particularly players, and go, do you know what, their idea's better, run with it, because the story is better, how people receive it is better than I have this lovely idea. We used to have the sort of problem back in RuneScape of in the olden days, like the very start of the game, there wasn't any kind of narrative team or anything like that. So it was all individual stories that people owned, which meant that things sort of bashed against each other a few times, and they set up some difficult expectations that, to this day, I think RuneScape's still not able to pull off some of them. I think the classic one being every storyline ended with a complete new city, like a brand new city full of content, full of quests. Like every single storyline had them, which obviously is a bit much, right? It's
Not very sustainable, no.
Scope out the consequences. Always scope out your consequences, including things like that. And if it's not possible, don't do it.
That's an important thing as well. Don't promise. Like, hint, step towards, don't promise.
Do you ever find that, when you hint and not promise, like if you hint at something, do people like expect it, or are they okay with you not doing it because game dev happened?
It depends a bit on how you go about that. Like, so there's hinting and there's hinting, and the latter one is effectively a promise in disguise. It's where you labour everything very, very heavily, saying, "Oh, it's saying, oh, there's a pot of gold behind this corner. Legend speaks of a pot of gold behind this corner. Have you heard the rumours of the pot of gold behind the corner?" If you can do that, behind the corner should be a pot of gold. Like, but if you've dropped a couple of hints that don't directly mean that, and you can have it lean towards. And this is the point. It's got to go somewhere. If you lead hints and stuff, they've got to be able to go somewhere. You should leave enough hints so they can be movable goalposts. And as long as they lead towards somewhere that is at least interesting, because that's the important one. It has to be interesting. You can't just resolve something. It's got to resolve interesting. It's got to resolve with at least people going, oh, okay. Like there's got to be at least an element of either surprise or cool revelation or payoff to it. Which doesn't necessarily need to be much in a lot of things. Like you'd be amazed how many people are okay with hints leading towards what is effectively a bit of a dumb joke, if you use it sparingly. Like you can do these things occasionally, but generally it has to pay off reasonably. But you get once in a blue moon, you get to troll the players, and they're okay with that. But it's got to be once in a blue moon. So yeah, you've got to you can hint, but it needs to be a hint if you're not going to pay it off as a promise. If it's a promise in disguise, be ready to pay it off. And like Diana has repeatedly said, scope the consequences of your actions.
Like how would you approach like scoping the consequences? Like what is kind of your process of designing narrative?
Do you want to take this, Diana?
I can go first. So
Yeah.
I think my disclaimer on this one is that I'm still relatively new to this. I've only been making narratives for live games for about 3 years. So a lot of the time I'm still working out my processes, especially when it comes to having a lot of control over the narrative instead of saying, right, this is the story that I just have to make work somehow. And instead of being given a story, I've only recently moved into making up the story myself. That's kind of where I am in my career. In terms of scoping out what I would do, it involves a lot of talking to other departments, a lot of saying, how much work would this take you? Because game narrative is almost always in service of the gameplay, and almost always, sometimes there are games where the narrative comes front and center, but most live games and most games in general, we are a supporting department. So we have to listen to the environment artists, we have to listen to the animators and the character artists, and everyone whose budget is much tighter than ours. Because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, we're going to write down all this amazing stuff and we're going to plan out all these brilliant stories. But if we want a new world and the environment can't do it, they can't do it, and we're the ones who are going to have to shift. So yeah, talking to everyone, getting a really clear idea of what's actually involved in the particular outcome you want to look at. And that can involve, one thing I've done in the past is, right, this is a sequence I want to have. This is a story sequence I want. Let's storyboard it. Let's figure out second by second, moment by moment game design. What is this going to look like for a player? What is this actually going to involve in terms of assets, in terms of environments, in terms of what the characters are doing? Because you might need animation time for that. So loads of collaboration, loads of learning to talk the languages of other departments to get a really clear idea of what's possible and what's not. And more often than not, you'll have an idea and your initial idea gets put to another department and they go, no. And you have to go back to the drawing board, and that happens. It's something that I think most game devs will be familiar with, is that you overscope, you always overscope, and then you cut. And you cut and you cut and you cut, and then you make something that's reasonable. And it might not be what you initially wanted, but as long as it does the job and it's good and players enjoy it, that's a success.
From my point of view, from a slightly the sort of longer term look at things, like Diana is very, very right to the rest of it. You plan it out, you show it to other people and say, can this be done? And they say no, you go, okay, sorry. And go back to the drawing board. But one of the things that you should do for the longer term thing, so before departments can actually take a look at all these things, is ideally set it up what you've got up with enough of the loose end so that you can rejig it, redesign it. So you should always have an idea of where you would like it to go, but have backup plans. So, like, classic example from RuneScape's history, and this is any RuneScape players reading this may scream when I mention the name of this quest. It never actually got made, but there was a quest called Rite of Passage that I pitched.
And it's been delayed for another 3 years.
Delayed for another 3 years. Sorry, that's a running joke. And Rite of Passage, I had the original idea, but because it was still not cancelled, it was only ever shelved. The idea of it had to tweak and change. So I think by the end of it, I had like, how many pitches of it did I have? Some like 8 or 9 pitches waiting in the wings of like ways it could continue the story, but be varied based on how the game went. So I had the versions of whether the god died, whether the god was on world, whether the god was off world, whether the story X had happened, story Y had happened, all very high level view. None of them were in some great detail, but you need to have that kind of sense of going, right, this could change, and spoiler, probably will change. So having those to hand, having an idea of things you could flip, because one of the important big words that you hear in live development a lot is pivot, which is when you have to make a big decision quickly. And you have to change like quite a big focus direction of what you were doing. So things like for RuneScape, we'd be working on sort of one particular angle, like maybe focus on combat, and then we'd realize, oh god, actually players really want us to focus on like skilling. So we'd turn around to focus on farming rather than murdering one another. And you have to have the stuff set up to be able to do that, and be able to keep in mind how you can do that. So having just a few quick, we could do this prepared. At the very sort of high level, but when I say high level, I mean like a few paragraphs to basically sum it up, because once you've got the paragraphs, you can then go on from there and make it work. But having all that in place is a sensible plan. It's kind of the offshoot of scope the consequences of your actions, because it's scope the consequences of your actions if things go wrong or if things change, because spoiler, they will.
And going back to like the conversation about like the world destruction and stuff, how would you? I guess like we didn't like finish that conversation, but like how would you deal with the players not knowing that the world isn't ending?
It's a tricky one, because also we didn't succeed in that in RuneScape. I'll be blunt in saying that. Like we didn't succeed in players not feeling that the world was a threat, because they knew we weren't going to delete the game. Some of them tried to engineer it because they wanted to see what we would do. So my first advice is, if you're thinking of that storyline, scale it back in some way. Think in terms of going, okay, rather than destroy the world, are there aspects of the world that I can damage or injure? If I'm going to that storyline, am I willing to put that threat in, even if it's only temporary? So, like a good example being, rather than destroying the world, am I okay with disabling this very popular city? Like, if I take out the city, even if it's for just like a handful of months, which you could do in the background, you could use them to rework the area, right? You could redo everything, but you could take it out of play. That's suddenly something that players are familiar with and they've lost. But you've got to be willing to do it for a short term. Unless you've decided you want to cut this piece of content completely, Camelot, and then you can do that. You can get rid of it. But yeah, you've got to be able to know what threat you can give them and what damage you can give them. And if you're unwilling to give them that damage, don't pitch that threat. Because also it's important to know, like, those big world-ending threats sound great. Like, the Marvel films have done great with like all the big, Thanos is going to click his fingers and everyone dies. Oh my god, the horror. But it's not those that actually engage people. It's not the big world threat that people care about. Like, people use the Thanos snap, but that's not interesting. What is interesting is the characters. If you look at all the memes and stuff, it's about how, if I'm talking about Marvel, how Tony interacts with, Peter Parker, how the characters see one another, speak to one another, and that's how you make those threats matter, because you make them personal. So if you're going to have big threats, you make them about people that people care about. So make a character that someone loves, and then stab them, or not. You could just injure them if you want. You don't necessarily have to kill them, but because these things matter. If you can make someone betray someone, that hits way harder than the world's going to end. If you've got your bestest friend ever has now stabbed you in the back, and taken everything from you, players will drop everything else to go after that for the revenge thing. Like, again, test it in D&D first, and you'll find, like, if you have an NPC that everyone loves, like Bob the Goblin, and then Bob robs you blind and tries to stab you in the kidneys, you get revenge on Bob the Goblin. Often violently, but that's because D&D players are psychopaths. Yeah, sorry. But yeah, be prepared to, if you're going to write the story, think about how you can actually deal that damage and what damage matters. And I would argue, look at the personal, look at the human, look at the bits that where you can, damaging someone's character is annoying. Punching someone in the gut, like emotionally sort of hurting them, that sticks. Like, you remember those moments. People are emotional creatures, and that's how you grab them. That's how you make those threats matter. You make them personal.
Yeah, I think a nice. I'm just thinking about live games that do that well. Warframe did a very cool twist a while ago that revealed something quite personal about the player character. In terms of, I'm going to say spoilers for Warframe. Quite a big one.
Anyone who wants to just like skip ahead a few minutes.
Spoilers for Warframe, but there was the reveal that the Tenno characters are actually children, and that your pilot, your operator within the, like, inside that war suit is a child, which was a nuts twist. Absolutely bonkers. But it's that emotional impact, because then you're suddenly thinking about the consequences of it, and you're thinking about, how did these kids get into that situation? How did I, as this child, get into this situation? That kind of emotional gut punch is extremely effective, because, the world is ending yet again. Eventually that loses all meaning. So I think that's a wider storytelling point as well. It's not just applicable to live games there. Yeah, it's getting that hook and getting that interest from people, especially if you want an emotional investment in your game, is go for the personal rather than the grand stories, because you can pull off grand stories and make them personal, but I would argue that the smaller stories are more effective from that point of view.
Yeah, like, I think thinking to anything that ever had like a grand story, everything after that kind of doesn't feel that good anymore, because like, how do you, like, you can't really like go so high and then like go back to personal.
Yeah, exactly, right? And like, I remember, if we're talking about Marvel, I'll bring up Endgame. Like, I remember watching Endgame and thinking, right, that's that. And, it had reached the high point, and I just had lost interest completely. And they've tried to keep it going, from my point of view anyway, as a relatively casual fan. I just don't care anymore, because they've, as far as I'm concerned, they finished the story in Endgame. And that is something to be wary of in terms of what stories you choose to tell within a live game. I think that kind of feeling is directly applicable, of like, how high and how intense do you want to go, because your story is not going to end there. Like we said at the start, they are in theory going to carry on in perpetuity. So in terms of choosing what stories you want to tell, make sure you can pick yourself up after the big high and then keep going. And it is difficult. It's a really interesting challenge, and it's as a storyteller, it is quite a different approach to how you're often taught how to do storytelling. Like, hero's journey buzzer, bzz, hero's journey is very rarely applicable to games anyway, but it's particularly not applicable to live games, because the whole point of that is you go through crises to grow, to change, and to come to an end point. And again, like, not having an end point really changes what the kind of story is. And I think a lot of this stuff isn't formalized. You know, if someone was to come up to me and say, okay, how do you do a story structure for live games? Like, there aren't really any. Like, games in general are a young medium, and live games are even younger, especially games that have a significant amount of story content in them. So we are still figuring out the best ways of doing this stuff, I think, as an industry. So yeah, if there's any like aspiring live game writers in the audience who say, "Oh yeah, how do you do this?" I'm like, come back to me in 10 years when maybe we figured something out, and then we'll talk.
Or maybe go and figure it yourself.
Yeah,
out.
or like, right, yeah, maybe you could go sort it out for us. But it makes it really a really exciting industry to be in because it's quite experimental. We're still kind of like, how do we integrate it with mechanics? How do we integrate it with seasons and battle passes and the tropes and trappings of live games that are becoming more commonplace as live games grow in popularity? Because they're an extremely popular medium. Sometimes people look down on them, but a lot of people play them. A lot of people really enjoy them because they are worlds that you get to live in and you get to have fun in. So as we develop, I think it's going to be a really interesting part of the industry to be part of as it grows and matures and starts developing its own formalisms like standalone games do. I keep wanting to call, like, what's the opposite of a live game? I don't want to say dead game because that just sounds really rude. Like a one shot or one and done. Like
contained narrative. Yeah.
Contained narrative. That's a really nice way of putting it. Like it will develop its formalisms, and I think they're going to look quite different to contained narratives because the structure is different, the aims are different. It's really cool, but yeah, a lot of the time I feel like I'm trying to convey concepts that I don't yet have the words for.
It's interesting because most games do use, like a lot of the sort of live service games actually do use that contained narrative approach. Like if you look at, like, you generally have like seasons or expansions that have a contained narrative within them, and they sort of bring it full circle and close off that narrative and then try and continue. And it doesn't quite work, I don't think. And I say this entirely because, of course, that's exactly what I did at RuneScape. It almost works. It mostly works, but it doesn't quite work because you've got to have the concept of the whole arcing thing as a contained narrative as well. Because that is one of the big problems, just on a random tangent, but one of the big problems of live service games is they don't have a defined endpoint, which means quite often they don't come to an end, which means that you have this, if you're not careful with your stories, you have a big kind of build-up with loads of secrets and plot hooks that you never finish. My favorite MMO that I play is a game called Secret World. And the Secret World is this lovely sort of horror setting, storytelling really good. Game has its problems, and
it's beautifully written. We've played it together a couple of times, and it's
written.
gorgeously written.
Yeah. But that has like it's setting itself up for something quite big with a big reveal of the narrative, the arc and stuff. But it's very clear that they weren't getting the players that they wanted, so they have effectively sunset it. They haven't told us they've sunset it, but given they haven't updated it in 2 years, they've sunsetted it. And that ends on like a literal cliffhanger. It says, the next stuff you need is in this location. Big spoilers, we're going here next. And of course, we're not going to. And that creates a sort of, I mean, we've seen it with TV shows, right? There are plenty of TV shows that end on a cliffhanger, and they drive people nuts. There are numerous ones. So was it Reaper jumps to mind, ends on a massive cliffhanger. There was a TV series called Hex that ends literally with the world about to end and like angels descending, and that just nothing. That's just ended there.
He just stops.
Literally, that's it. And you're sort of like, what?
Surely they got cancelled though, rather than actually end.
Well, they no, so they got cancelled, but they got cancelled after they'd had their like third season greenlit. So they wrote their the ending of season 2, assuming there was going to be a season 3. And then the people with the money went, nah, it's not making enough money. We're not going to bother. So they don't finish it. And that's when you finish it in, like, you hope that there's a writer or someone who really cares about it, who will then like go on a blog and say, well, this is how it was going to end. most won't, particularly with games, because of course games, there's a lot of money behind games, and people protect those IPs desperately. So you don't often get that with games, but yeah, you've got to be careful with where you picture, and always try and have in your mind of, if this is where the story ends, then it should feel okay to end here. Even though you don't want it to end, but if it's going to end, make it feel okay. Sorry, rambled.
On the topic of like ending, Diana, you mentioned something like with the Marvel when it felt like the end of the story. But it's not only like the grand narratives, like the grand high points that feel like it. So like, how do you make sure that all of your narratives that you're putting in the live game don't feel like an end, and people do come back after that?
So that is a very good question. It is, to me, about cultivating continued investment. And that means you have to go beyond the stories. I think this is again a general point about narrative design for games. It is about a lot more than just this is the story we're putting in. It's a lot more about it's about a lot more than those seasonal arcs. It's about making a world that players want to keep coming back to, about in terms of atmosphere and vibe. And it's about making characters that players like interacting with. And this is something I think RuneScape did very well. It created a bunch of NPCs that were just really compelling and really interesting to talk to. And you wanted to know what they were getting up to on a day-to-day basis, and you wanted to know more about them and to theory craft and to speculate about them. So that even though their particular story arcs might end, and a quest series might end, you still want to keep talking to them, and you still want to build a relationship with them, even though it's not a real relationship, but you want to feel like you're part of their world. And narrative design is a big part of that, in terms of character creation and what interactions a player can have with someone. And I think Destiny too does it quite well as well. Like from what I've seen in the Destiny community, players just love these characters that they're part, that they are sharing the world with, and that contributes to a continued investment outside of. Obviously there are other parts to live games that people keep coming back to. There's new skilling methods, new rewards, new all that nonsense that come with the game. Obviously, like as narrative people, it's like, yeah, sure, someone else will take care of that. But yeah, in terms of like, how do you end a story and then keep getting people back in, which I think is what your question was about there. Yeah, so it's cultivating that investment, creating a world that players enjoy spending time in, so that they come back, they talk to people, they talk to characters, they like being there. And that's just reminded me of a game that does it extremely well, that technically isn't a live game, Hades, which is a roguelike. Roguelite, sorry, technical. The the purists will get me for that one. Roguelite that does something that is basically what you want, which is every time you go back to Hades, there's new things to do, there's new people to talk to, there's new story to uncover, and that's the thing you want, right? That's what gets story people and people who care about narrative in, is rewarding them for that engagement and making sure they have the stuff to engage with, they actually like to engage with. Even though maybe the story itself is over for that season, giving people kind of more outside of the individual storylines, I think, is the key there. That part of that is knowing your player base and knowing what they want. And, like in RuneScape, it was post-quest dialogue and extra secrets and lore dumps and books that people could hunt down. Like, that's kind of how you would keep the engagement, because that's what people liked. It's what people found fun. Other games, other player bases would have it differently. The project me and James are working on at the moment doesn't have a player base yet. So it was like, how are we going to do that? Not quite sure yet, but we'll see. It'll be it's an interesting one, though. And I definitely, one of the things what James mentioned earlier about being light on your feet and adapting to what players actually do in your game is quite important there.
It's the kind of thing of, just to sort of jump in on that, but it's the focusing less on the story and more on the world. I think, slightly begrudgingly I say this, but the FromSoft games do this quite nicely, because like I've played Elden Ring a fair amount, and there's technically a story, honest, but what they have is this really interesting world with lots of little bits and lots of little notes here and there that you can look at, follow, and start to piece together, and then you can theorize and discuss and whatnot. And like, there's numerous sort of streamers and podcast people who dissect and go on to go into it in great detail, but the actual story is relatively light. It's I am person that has some sort of, I still don't know what a tarnished is, and I want to become the Elden Lord because it sounds spangly, and that's largely the story, right? There's more nuance to it, but that's kind of the story. But it's everything else beyond that. It's like, who are these characters? Why does this matter? What can I pick out? Where are these things from? And having enough of that richness in your world to be able to go ooh, and piece that apart and be relatively hard. And it's about filling, and this may make some lore players scream in horror, but it's about filling your lore and history with enough holes for players to fill them. Enough gaps for people to see what's written between them, see what's between the lines, that they can dig into and find out. Because if everything is very detailed and established, then people will read it and they'll go, okay, that's it. It's assigned. Whereas if people go, well, I've got enough of a hint to say, hey, I have this theory, and then you get those beautiful moments, which is where you sit in on Discords where you've got the lore players in, and player one goes, hey, I think this character is secretly this. Another person goes, no, you moron. They're obviously this chicken in a hat because. And they'll argue. And they'll argue with random facts and correlations that make sense only to them. Neither of these will be the intended thing that was in whoever's developer's head that wrote at the time. But there's enough of a gap there, enough hole that people can fill them, and they fill them with their own experiences, their own conversations. They take the game outside of the game, and they take it out to this community, and then the community gets involved, and you start to have all manner of ridiculous Reddit fights over stupid stuff. That these random, beautifully insane theories that obviously we didn't write because we weren't drunk when we wrote it. And
Speak
yet,
for yourself.
That's fair. I would never claim for Mod Stu to be sober when writing lore, but yeah, it's all about making the gaps in it. So there is always stuff that people can think about, but it isn't necessary for them to feel that what they've been told is incomplete. Like, it's a real fine line, and it's very easy to miss. Hands up, I've done it quite a lot. I've missed it quite a lot, but the times where it's worked, it works beautifully well.
You've made a good point there about the community aspect of live game storytelling as well. Often, because you are being light on your feet and because you are responding to the community, or not responding to the community, but you are kind of keeping track of community engagement as the game progresses and as new updates get added in. There's a lot of opportunity for storytelling that involves the community, storytelling that kind of reflects and respects what the community wants and what they are currently involved in and what they're interested in. And you can do stuff that kind of involves a lot of community engagement, like many live games. Elite Dangerous is an example. Like, I worked on that a few years ago as QA. Most of their storytelling and story beats was done via kind of community voting, effectively. Like, how many people are going, it was all kind of communal in that sense, and players would spring up in factions and develop their own stories kind of built around their clans and their guilds that become part of the game lore because there is a large evolving community associated with it. The multiplayer aspect really can't be overlooked. Like, this isn't one person playing a game, this is groups of people and guilds, clans, even just 3 friends, whatever, playing a game. And that aspect of it is extremely important. And it's often why branching choice doesn't work in live games. Just a segue.
I
Because
assume there is a story in RuneScape for the branching choice.
a little bit. I will let James handle that if he wants to expand on it. But effectively, players often ask for branching choice. And I think players who aren't familiar with game dev will often say, oh, yeah, we want branching choice because it sounds cool. And like, most games don't do choice very well. I will be a small molehill that I will die on. The vast majority of games who do branching choice don't do branching choice very well. And it's often, it's better to have a small number of well executed choices than lots of meaningless ones, but that's a different argument. But when you have thousands of people playing, like hundreds of thousands of people playing your game every day for hours at a time, you can't give them all unique choices and expect the game to be able to handle that. You will probably get a systems programmer knocking on your door at 3 a.m. threatening to kill you. Like it's again, scope the consequences. It's not possible. If you are like player choice and player agency and that kind of thing, it's something I'm personally fascinated by, especially how do you even do that into a live game? And the conclusion I've come to at the moment is that you can't really offer extreme levels of individual choice in a live game that you can in a single player game. Mass Effect 3, was it Mass Effect 3 that had the 3 endings? Like there's a whole bunch of games that have, right, you make a choice and that decides your ending. Mm-hmm. Can't do that. You could maybe do it on an individual level. Like, sorry, when I say individual level in this sense, I mean like on a small scale level. But big choices that affect the world, they kind of have to be communal and kind of almost democratic. Do most players want this? Or it's not the kind of thing your game can actually do if it's a live game. And that's a very important consideration. Remember that most live games are multiplayer, and there's lots of room and opportunity for interesting stories in there, but there's also extra constraints.
It's also worth noting, just in terms of how gamers think, which is that most of the games that offer the big divergent choices are single-player games, and the key important reason of doing the divergent choices so that you replay them. There are various games I have that have choices that I've replayed ridiculous number of times, but a live game, even games where you can replay the quests, you generally only get to do the choice once. And what happens is players end up in a sort of choice paralysis because they want the right ending, the best ending. And I've known, so I one of the examples I wanted in RuneScape is I put a quest in, God, like a decade ago now, and that had in it at the end there was a choice, and it was deliberately a morally grey choice. It was that you could either send this character off to die with his people because his people are all dying out, or you could send him to go and be sort of locked in stasis with this mad scientist person who might be able to fix his people. So it was like, do you go with the sort of the happy slow decline, like getting to spend his last few days with his people, or do you go the possibility of hope for people, but he will effectively live in stasis in misery? It's like a deliberately morally grey decision. And what happened is people got to that and they stopped playing. And they just did not advance the quest. Like there was a good number of people that literally stopped at that point until they'd read guides, until they got a good sense of where it was going, etc. To the point that I had to a developer kind of point out that like it's not going to make a huge difference to which your choice. Like there isn't a right choice, is what I had to say. Like both choices are equally valid, and both choices will equally lead to sort of a resolution. And when we brought the story back in, we of course had to do the whole bring it all back into the same sort of thing, because again, you can't make two entirely separate quests for someone who's done one choice, particularly if they've got a separate thing, because that way madness lies. Because once you've got one choice, that effectively means you've got to have 4 different quests after your second choice, because it will just branch and branch and branch and branch, and that's just not sustainable. But players get stuck with it because unless they specifically want a game where it's about choice, they generally don't want it, because games, particularly things like MMOs, particularly things like live service games, are a distraction, a hobby, somewhere safe and relaxing to be. It's the equivalent of rewatching an old favorite TV show because you've seen it before. It keeps you happy. You don't want the anxiety. You don't want any surprises. You just want that kind of comfort blanket of something familiar. And particularly things like MMOs fit that comfort blanket. You know how the game is going to play out. You know your character inside out. Like, you know where things go. So you want the stories to not necessarily tax you too much. Because otherwise you get to the point of going, oh, I've got so much stress. Even my hobbies are causing me stress. Oh no. Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, rambled again.
I know exactly which choice that is, actually. It's from One of a Kind, isn't it?
Yep.
And I can confirm I played it as a player. Really difficult choice to It's really good though. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It's good fun.
Literally, like every time I have a choice in like narrative games, I go to Google and see
Yeah.
how they end up, because like
Yeah.
I'm not making a choice that is gonna lead to a bad decision. Like
It's
not
leading to bad decisions, and like, is this going to be optimal for my character? Like, long term, is this going to get me an extra reward that I might need for a later update? Like, choices are, I could rant for an hour about game choices, like about how games do them well, how they're done poorly, and yada yada yada. But yeah, if I've seen pitches and I've seen people starting out, making the mistake of, oh, I'm going to make an MMO for my first game, which don't.
in general, just don't right now.
Just don't. But it's like, oh, I'm going to have an MMO and it's going to be narrative focused, it's going to be branching narrative, and I'm like, I give you 3 months before you realize why that's a bad idea. I'm not saying it can't be done, it's just difficult. And narrative games, MMOs possibly aren't the best choice of game genre and gameplay type if you want a lot of branching narrative. That's not saying it can't be done. I'm sure it can. I've yet to see it done well in MMOs. But yeah, just like, if you are choosing to make an MMO, I think this is a broader thing, just be careful and be mindful of your scope and the long-term consequences of those narrative choices.
My general advice to anyone who's doing, and this is something I learned way too late, but my general advice for doing choices in MMO is let people choose who their character is, but not necessarily what their character does. The choice shouldn't be about how it modifies the world, but the choice should be, how do I sound when I'm talking to someone? Like, if I'm talking to this character, let them be, overly friendly and polite. Let them be kind and, this sort of superheroic type. Let them be a sarcastic asshole, or let them be, an evil, nasty person that's just like, I will murder all of your children. Let people have that choice. Let people have those options, so they can play the character they want to play. They can be the character they want to be, and then you can have dialogue responses that's based on that will feel like you are then part of this story. But it's okay for the actual event to all be the same. Just let the way the player experiences them in terms of how their character presents be their choice. That's how I would generally recommend doing it, because that gives you the choice that matters for something like MMO. Because again, players don't tend to play MMOs for the choice. I don't think I can name a single MMO that's done it well. And that includes things I've worked on. But players do care about who they are. They do care about what their character is and how those characters get along with things. So make the choice be that. Don't make the choice be big branching things.
Yeah, I think that the role playing is an important aspect of it. You can give role playing choices, and again, this is a live game thing. People play it for a long time and get really attached to their avatar and their character, and there's a lot of customization. And maybe they've chosen a specific class, like in Final Fantasy, and like, right, I am this kind of character. I specialize in this sort of thing. Some MMOs don't really have class based systems, but I know some do. Allowing players choices that offer them, that say, right, we see that you are this kind of player, and we see that you like saying these kind of things, and you like having this kind of personality, and then we reward that investment with, here's the stuff we're going to offer you to say that fits with your character. That is definitely a good thing to do. Letting players feel seen and letting them kind of play and speak the way they want to speak within the world, as long as it makes sense within the world, obviously. And, there can be some limitations in terms of sometimes the kind of story you're telling needs something to happen, and you just need to not shoehorn it in, obviously, but you need to be clever about the way you write it to get everyone into it, even if maybe it doesn't quite fit their character. But yeah, like recognizing that players invest a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of love into their avatars is extremely important. It's not like Aloy in Horizon Zero Dawn. I feel like I've named the wrong game.
No,
But is that
you're
right? Yeah, that is the right one.
Yeah.
Brain short-circuited there for a second. Like, wait, where's that coming from? But because she is a distinct character, and she exists externally to the player, while MMO characters are usually the player's representation of themselves and the kind of character they want to be within the world. So respecting that and, allowing for it and giving players the opportunity to play that way is a very key aspect of MMOs and extremely important.
On that note, I think we're running out of time, so let's conclude here. Do you have any last points to the audience on the topic or just in general?
Scope the consequences of your choice.
Scope the consequences. Thank you, Mod Jack, for summarising that. Because I think it's something I'm going to take with me for the rest of my career. It's so important. I don't think I've got anything specific that can't really apply to game writing in general. I could talk about this for hours, so I won't continue there. But yeah, no, live games are fun to do story for. They're really challenging. They're really interesting, and they offer a whole suite of problems that you never knew existed before you even get there. But it's all good fun.
Yeah, and I would just tag on, like, if you're writing for a live service game, use your community. Don't necessarily sit with them, get them to tell you the story, but hide there, sneak there, watch what they're doing, see what sort of things they're talking about and where they leave their knowledge, because they are an invaluable tool. They will tell you all of the secrets that you've forgotten, and they will have wonderful theories that you can latch onto, and they'll also show you what people care about. And that's the last point is probably the most important part, because it's all well and good saying, "Haha, I'm going to answer this question from 5 years ago. That's really something that's been in my head." If no one remembers it, no one cares. It's not worth answering. But if they have this thing that they're all going, ooh, 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 and you can answer that, answer it.
Yeah, I think you are writing, and the world you are creating is for your player base, and that's something you should always bear in mind, is that especially if you're joining an MMO as a writer rather than building it yourself, like, there is a player base, the game is theirs, and you write for them. You don't write for you write for your players. And if you make them happy, then you've succeeded. That's all that's really needed.
Very nicely said. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing your experience with us. Do you want to share with the audience where people can find you, like Twitter or something like that, if someone wants to follow you, for example?
Sure, I've got Twitter. I'm JS_Crowther on Twitter and Hive, and Dark-Hearted Raven on Reddit and Tumblr.
Yeah. I don't actually have Twitter anymore. I nuked it fairly recently, but you can find me on Discord. I'm in various game writing communities, and you can also find me in the RuneScape Discord.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this concludes another episode of the Game Dev London podcast. I've been your host, Anna. Thank you very much for tuning in. For more episodes and more information, please go to our website, gamedev.london, and see you here same time next week. Bye!